The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Elena Volkov adjusted her standard-issue rifle for the 100th time. At 23, she had already proven herself among the top marksmen in her unit, consistently outperforming her male counterparts in accuracy tests and tactical exercises. Her superiors had taken notice, but not in the way she had hoped. "Volkov, report to command immediately," barked Sergeant Major Petrov, his weathered face showing the usual mixture of irritation and dismissal that had become so familiar to Elena over the past 18 months of service. Elena's combat boots clicked against the concrete floor as she made her way through the sterile corridors of the military complex. The walls were lined with portraits of decorated officers, all men, their stern faces seeming to judge her as she passed. She had grown accustomed to being the only woman in most rooms, but the weight of constant scrutiny never became easier to bear. The command office door stood slightly ajar, revealing voices engaged in heated discussion. Elena caught fragments of conversation that made her stomach tighten with anticipation and dread. Words like inappropriate, distracting to the men, and traditional roles filtered through the gap, each phrase hitting her like a physical blow. Colonel Fedorov, a man whose reputation for conservative views was well known throughout the base, looked up as Elena entered and saluted. His gray eyes swept over her with the kind of assessment typically reserved for equipment inspections rather than human beings. Behind him stood 3 other officers, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "Private Volkov," the colonel began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your performance in combat training has been noted, however. Concerns have been raised about your suitability for frontline combat operations." Elena's jaw tightened, but she maintained perfect military posture. She had anticipated this moment for weeks, sensing the growing tension among her superiors as her scores continued to surpass those of her male colleagues. The unofficial complaints had been mounting, accusations that she was trying too hard to prove herself, that her presence was causing unnecessary competition and friction among the troops. "Sir, I don't understand," Elena replied, though she understood perfectly. "My marksmanship scores are consistently in the top 5%, and my tactical assessments have all been exemplary." Colonel Fedorov's expression hardened. "This is not about your individual performance, Private. This is about unit cohesion and the greater good of military effectiveness. Effective immediately, you are being reassigned to supply logistics. You will surrender your rifle and all combat equipment today." The words hit Elena like a series of physical blows. She had spent countless hours perfecting her skills, pushing her body and mind to their limits, dreaming of serving her country in meaningful ways. The rifle she carried wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol of her equality, her capability, her right to stand alongside her fellow soldiers as an equal defender of their homeland. "Sir, with all due respect, I believe there may be some mistake," Elena said, her voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside her. "I have met and exceeded every requirement for combat readiness. My physical fitness scores, psychological evaluations, and technical proficiencies all qualify me for active duty." Major Kozlov, one of the officers standing behind the colonel, stepped forward with an expression of barely concealed contempt. "Private, you seem to misunderstand your place here. The decision has been made by people far above your pay grade, based on considerations you couldn't possibly comprehend. Your job now is to follow orders, not question them." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she processed the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just a reassignment. It was a systematic stripping away of everything she had worked toward. In logistics, she would be relegated to counting supplies and managing inventory, her tactical training rendered useless, her marksmanship skills left to deteriorate from lack of practice. "You have 1 hour to collect your personal belongings and report to Quartermaster Thompson," Colonel Fedorov continued, his tone suggesting the matter was already closed. "Your replacement has already been selected from the current training class." As Elena turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface of a memorial plaque on the wall. The woman staring back at her looked defeated, diminished, but somewhere in her eyes burned a flame that no amount of institutional prejudice could extinguish. She had always known that being a woman in the military would present unique challenges, but she had naively believed that competence and dedication would eventually triumph over bias. Walking back to her barracks, Elena passed groups of male soldiers who either avoided her gaze entirely or watched her with a mixture of pity and relief. Word traveled fast in military installations, and by now everyone would know about her reassignment. Some would see it as proof that women didn't belong in combat roles, while others might recognize it for what it truly was, a systematic attempt to maintain the status quo regardless of individual merit. That evening, as Elena packed her few personal possessions into a standard military duffel bag, she made a silent promise to herself. This setback would not define her future or limit her potential. She would find ways to maintain her skills, to prove her worth, and to demonstrate that the decision to strip her of her rifle was not just wrong. It was a dangerous underestimation of her capabilities. Little did her superiors know that their attempt to neutralize her as a combat asset would soon backfire in ways they could never have imagined. Elena Volkov was about to transform from a conventional soldier into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. 3 months after her reassignment to logistics, Elena had adapted to her new routine with grim determination. The supply depot was a world away from the tactical training grounds. Endless rows of shelves containing everything from medical supplies to ammunition, managed by a small crew of soldiers who had either been injured, disciplined, or deemed unsuitable for combat roles. Her supervisor, Quartermaster Thompson, was a gruff but fair man in his 50s who had lost his left leg to an improvised explosive device during a peacekeeping mission years earlier. Unlike many of her previous superiors, he judged Elena purely on her work performance, and her meticulous attention to detail and organizational skills had quickly earned his respect. "Volkov, I need you to run inventory on the small arms cache," Thompson called from his cluttered office one Tuesday morning. "We've got discrepancies in the monthly reports that need sorting before the inspection team arrives next week." Elena nodded and made her way to the secure section of the warehouse where weapons were stored before distribution to active units. The familiar weight of rifles and pistols in her hands brought back memories of her combat training, and she found herself automatically checking the mechanisms and sighting systems of each weapon she cataloged. During quiet moments between official duties, Elena had been secretly maintaining her physical conditioning and combat readiness. She would wake before dawn to run the perimeter of the base, using supply crates and warehouse equipment to create obstacle courses that challenged her agility and strength. Her marksmanship skills were harder to maintain without access to official firing ranges, but she had discovered an abandoned section of the base where she could practice with improvised targets. The other logistics personnel had initially viewed Elena with suspicion, unsure why a combat-trained soldier had been assigned to their supposedly lesser duties. However, her work ethic and lack of complaints had gradually won over most of her colleagues. She never spoke about her reassignment or expressed bitterness about her situation, instead channeling her frustration into becoming the most efficient and reliable member of the logistics team. One afternoon, while organizing ammunition supplies, Elena overheard a conversation between 2 visiting officers from the Combat Training Division. They were discussing recent developments in the ongoing regional conflict that had been escalating over the past several weeks. Enemy forces had been conducting increasingly bold raids against military installations, and intelligence suggested that the base itself might be targeted in the near future. "Security protocols have been upgraded to level orange," one officer was saying. "All combat personnel are being briefed on defensive positions and contingency plans. The brass thinks they might try to hit our supply depot, knock out our logistical capabilities before mounting a larger assault." Elena's pulse quickened as she processed this information. The supply depot, her current workplace, was potentially a primary target. Yet as logistics personnel, she and her colleagues were considered non-combatants and would likely be evacuated rather than included in defensive preparations. The irony was bitter. She was stationed at a potential target but would be considered too valuable as a supply manager to risk in combat. That evening, Elena studied the base layout with new urgency. She memorized patrol routes, identified potential weak points in the perimeter, and mentally cataloged the defensive resources available in the supply depot. Her combat training, though officially deemed irrelevant, provided her with tactical insights that her logistics colleagues lacked. During the following weeks, tensions on the base continued to escalate. Combat units conducted frequent drills, security patrols were doubled, and rumors circulated about enemy reconnaissance activities in the surrounding area. Elena watched these preparations with growing frustration, knowing that her skills and training could contribute to the base's defense but unable to participate in any meaningful way. The other logistics personnel began showing signs of stress as the possibility of attack became more real. Some requested transfers to installations farther from the conflict zone, while others simply tried to ignore the mounting tension by focusing entirely on routine duties. Elena found herself in the unusual position of being simultaneously the most combat-ready and the most officially restricted member of the team. One evening, while conducting a routine security check of the supply depot, Elena discovered that someone had been tampering with the perimeter sensors around the warehouse. The damage was subtle but deliberate, the kind of sabotage that suggested professional military training rather than random vandalism. Her combat instincts, sharpened by months of suppressed readiness, immediately recognized the signs of reconnaissance activity. Elena reported her findings to Quartermaster Thompson, who promptly alerted base security. However, the investigation that followed was cursory at best, with security personnel treating the incident as minor vandalism rather than a potential security breach. Elena's attempts to explain the tactical implications of the damage were dismissed by officers who saw her as merely a supply clerk, rather than a trained soldier. The dismissal of her concerns only strengthened Elena's resolve to remain vigilant. She began conducting unofficial security patrols of the supply depot during her off-duty hours, using her knowledge of the facility's layout and her combat training to identify vulnerabilities that official security might miss. Her fellow logistics personnel thought she was being paranoid, but Elena's instincts told her that something significant was approaching. As the days passed, Elena noticed increasingly subtle signs of enemy activity around the base. Unusual vehicle movements in the distance, brief interruptions in communication systems, and small items missing from perimeter security posts all suggested that hostile forces were conducting detailed reconnaissance in preparation for some kind of operation. The most troubling aspect of the situation was Elena's growing realization that base security was inadequately prepared for the kind of sophisticated assault that the intelligence suggested. The defensive plans she had overheard focused on conventional attacks, rather than the coordinated infiltration tactics that the evidence pointed toward. Elena found herself in possession of crucial tactical insights but lacking any official channel to communicate them effectively. Her frustration reached a breaking point when she attempted to share her observations with her former commanding officer, only to be told that logistics personnel should focus on their assigned duties rather than playing soldier. The institutional blindness that had led to her reassignment was now potentially compromising the security of the entire base. Elena realized that she might soon be forced to choose between following orders and protecting the lives of her fellow soldiers. The combat training that her superiors had deemed inappropriate for a woman might soon become the base's last line of defense. The rifle they had taken from her hands would pale in comparison to the improvised weapons and tactics she was prepared to employ if the situation demanded it. The attack came at 03:47 hours on a moonless Thursday morning, exactly as Elena had predicted it would. The first indication of trouble was the sudden failure of perimeter lighting along the eastern fence line, followed by the barely audible sound of wire cutters working through the chain link barrier that separated the supply depot from the surrounding forest. Elena had been conducting one of her unofficial security patrols when the lights went dark. Her months of preparation had taught her to move through the warehouse complex in complete darkness, and she immediately took cover behind a stack of medical supply crates while assessing the situation. Through her night vision training, she could make out the silhouettes of at least 5 figures moving with military precision toward the main supply building. The base's official security response was slower than Elena had hoped. The guard posts along the main perimeter were focused on the administration buildings and barracks, leaving the supply depot with minimal coverage during the early morning hours. By the time the first alarm sounded, the infiltrators had already breached the outer fence and were approaching the warehouse where tons of ammunition, medical supplies, and communications equipment were stored. Elena's mind raced through tactical calculations as she watched the enemy soldiers advance. Their movement patterns indicated professional military training, and their equipment suggested they were part of a specialized infiltration unit rather than a random raiding party. Their objective was clearly the complete destruction of the supply depot, which would cripple the base's operational capacity for months. From her concealed position, Elena could see that the infiltrators were carrying explosive charges sufficient to level the entire warehouse complex. The loss of supplies would be devastating, but more importantly, the explosion would likely kill everyone in the surrounding buildings, including the logistics personnel who were sleeping in nearby barracks. The approaching figures moved with confidence, clearly expecting no resistance from what they assumed would be unarmed supply clerks and administrative personnel. Their intelligence had probably identified the depot as a soft target, defended only by routine security patrols that could be easily avoided or neutralized. Elena realized that she had, perhaps 90 seconds before the infiltrators reached their optimal positions for placing explosive charges. The base's security response team was still several minutes away, and even when they arrived, they would be dealing with professional soldiers who had already achieved tactical surprise and positional advantage. In that moment of crisis, Elena made the decision that would define the rest of her life. She abandoned her concealed position and moved swiftly toward the small arms storage area, where weapons were kept for distribution to active units. Her months of inventory work had given her intimate knowledge of every weapon's location, and muscle memory from her combat training guided her hands even in complete darkness. The first rifle she retrieved was a standard-issue assault weapon, loaded and ready for immediate use. Elena checked the mechanism automatically, her fingers confirming what her mind already knew about the weapon's condition and capabilities. The familiar weight in her hands felt like reuniting with an old friend, and for the first time in months, she felt truly capable of protecting herself and others. Elena's tactical assessment of the situation was swift and decisive. The 5 infiltrators had spread out to surround the main warehouse building, with 2 moving toward the primary explosive targets, while the other 3 provided security and prepared to eliminate any resistance. Their positions formed a rough perimeter that would normally be difficult to assault, but Elena's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave her significant advantages. Moving with the stealth techniques she had mastered during combat training, Elena positioned herself to engage the enemy from an unexpected angle. Her plan was simple but dangerous: neutralize the infiltrators before they could complete their mission, while avoiding the kind of prolonged firefight that would give them time to detonate their explosives as a final destructive act. The first infiltrator never saw her coming. Elena's approach was silent and precise, using shipping containers and supply pallets as cover, while she closed the distance to optimal firing range. Her shot was clean and immediate, dropping the soldier before he could raise an alarm or reach for his radio. The sound of gunfire shattered the pre-dawn silence, and Elena knew that her element of surprise would last only seconds. The remaining 4 infiltrators immediately shifted from their planned demolition mission to combat response, their training kicking in as they sought to identify and eliminate the unexpected threat. Elena's advantage lay not just in her marksmanship skills, but in her thorough knowledge of the supply depot's layout. While the infiltrators had to navigate unfamiliar terrain in darkness, she could move through the complex as naturally as walking through her own home. Every shadow, every obstacle, every potential firing position was part of her mental map of the battlefield. The second engagement came as Elena repositioned to prevent the infiltrators from regrouping. One of the soldiers had taken cover behind a fuel storage tank, a position that would normally provide excellent protection, but left him exposed to Elena's carefully chosen angle of attack. Her second shot was as precise as the first, neutralizing another threat before the enemy could fully adapt to the changed circumstances. By now, the remaining 3 infiltrators understood that they were facing a skilled opponent rather than panicked supply personnel. Their radio chatter, which Elena could partially overhear, indicated confusion about the number and positions of defenders. They had expected to face security guards, not someone with advanced combat training and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Elena's breathing remained steady as she prepared for the more challenging phase of the engagement. The remaining infiltrators would be more cautious now, using better cover and coordination in their attempts to complete their mission or escape. She had perhaps 60 seconds before base security arrived, and every moment increased the risk that the demolition charges would be activated regardless of the tactical situation. The third shot came as Elena exploited a gap in the enemy's defensive positions, catching an infiltrator as he attempted to move between cover points. Her marksmanship training, honed through countless hours of practice that her superiors had deemed inappropriate for a woman, proved devastatingly effective in the real combat situation they had insisted she would never face. With 3 infiltrators down, Elena faced the most dangerous phase of the engagement. The remaining 2 soldiers had recognized the tactical situation and were attempting to complete their primary mission, while simultaneously hunting her down. Their radio communications had shifted from confusion to grim determination, and Elena could hear them coordinating movements designed to flush her from cover. The 4th infiltrator made his move toward the primary explosive target, a central support column that would bring down the entire ammunition storage section if destroyed. Elena had anticipated this possibility and had positioned herself to intercept such an attempt. But engaging him would expose her to fire from his partner, who had taken an overwatch position with clear sightlines across the warehouse floor. Elena's combat training had emphasized the importance of tactical patience, but in this situation, every second of delay increased the risk of catastrophic explosion. She calculated angles and distances with the precision that had once impressed her instructors, those same instructors who had ultimately deemed her unfit for combat operations. The shot she took was the most challenging of her military career, a moving target at maximum effective range, with limited time to aim, while under potential observation from a hostile sniper. Elena's breathing slowed to the rhythm she had practiced thousands of times on training ranges, her finger finding the trigger's sweet spot with mechanical precision. The 4th infiltrator dropped just meters short of his target, the explosive charge falling from his lifeless hands to skitter across the concrete floor. Elena immediately shifted position, knowing that the final enemy soldier would now be focused entirely on eliminating her rather than completing the demolition mission. The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant sound of approaching security vehicles and the steady hum of ventilation systems. Elena knew that her final opponent was somewhere in the maze of supply shelves and equipment, armed and dangerous, possibly wounded, and certainly desperate. This was no longer about preventing destruction. It was about survival. Elena's advantage in terrain knowledge became crucial as she engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with the remaining infiltrator. Her months of working in the supply depot had taught her which floors creaked, which paths provided concealment, and which positions offered multiple escape routes. The enemy soldier, despite his professional training, was operating in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who knew every shadow and sound. The psychological pressure of being the sole survivor of his unit was also working in Elena's favor. The infiltrator's radio calls had grown increasingly frantic as he realized that his entire team had been eliminated by what intelligence had suggested would be minimal resistance. His tactical discipline was beginning to crack under the strain of isolation and unexpected failure. Elena moved through the warehouse like a ghost, using techniques she had learned in advanced reconnaissance training to mask her movements and create false indicators of her position. She scattered small objects to generate misleading sounds, used reflective surfaces to observe areas she couldn't directly see, and employed breathing techniques to remain absolutely silent during critical moments. The final engagement came when the surviving infiltrator made a desperate attempt to reach the explosives dropped by his fallen comrade. Elena had anticipated this move and had positioned herself to cover the device from multiple angles. As the soldier broke from cover in a sprint toward the explosives, Elena's training and preparation culminated in a single, decisive shot. The warehouse fell completely silent. Elena remained in position for several more seconds, ensuring that all threats had been neutralized before emerging from cover. Her mental chronometer told her that the entire engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds from first shot to final elimination of hostile forces. As base security forces finally reached the supply depot, they found Elena standing calmly among the neutralized infiltrators, her rifle held in a safe position, her breathing steady and controlled. The explosive charges lay harmlessly on the warehouse floor, their timers never activated, their destructive potential rendered meaningless by the swift tactical response they had not anticipated. The security team leader, a captain who had previously dismissed Elena's warnings about inadequate perimeter defense, stared at the scene with undisguised amazement. 5 professional soldiers, armed and equipped for a sophisticated demolition mission, had been completely neutralized by a single defender, the same woman who had been deemed unfit for combat operations just months earlier. Elena's report to the responding officers was precise and factual. She described the infiltrators' approach route, their equipment and tactics, the timeline of the engagement, and her own actions in response to the threat. Her tone was professional and unemotional, giving no indication of the adrenaline that was still coursing through her system or the profound satisfaction she felt at having proven her capabilities in the most decisive way possible. The ammunition and supplies that Elena had saved were worth millions of dollars, but more importantly, her actions had prevented casualties among the logistics personnel and security forces who would have been in the blast radius of the planned explosion. The base's operational capacity remained intact, and the enemy's intelligence about soft targets had been proven dramatically wrong. As dawn broke over the supply depot, Elena found herself surrounded by investigators, medical personnel, and curious onlookers drawn by reports of the night's events. The same officers who had stripped her of her combat role were now struggling to comprehend how she had single-handedly defeated a professional military unit in less than 2 minutes of actual engagement. The irony was not lost on Elena as she watched Colonel Fedorov examine the scene of her tactical victory. The man who had declared her unfit for combat operations was now studying the evidence of her superior battlefield performance, his face showing a mixture of disbelief and grudging recognition that his assessment had been catastrophically wrong. Quartermaster Thompson approached Elena as the initial chaos began to settle. His expression combined pride, amazement, and deep respect for what she had accomplished. "Volkov," he said quietly, "I think your logistics career might be coming to an end." Elena smiled for the first time in months, finally understanding that her true military career was just beginning. The aftermath of Elena's successful defense of the supply depot created a bureaucratic nightmare for the military command structure. Official reports needed to be filed, but explaining how a logistics clerk had outperformed an entire special operations unit posed serious challenges for officers who had recently declared her unfit for combat duty. Colonel Fedorov found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to justify his decision to reassign Elena while simultaneously recommending her for commendation. The contradiction was obvious to everyone involved, and senior command was asking pointed questions about the assessment process that had led to such a spectacular misjudgment of personnel capabilities. Elena spent the following days being interviewed by military investigators, intelligence officers, and tactical analysts who wanted to understand exactly how she had achieved such decisive results. Her detailed breakdown of the engagement revealed a level of tactical thinking and battlefield awareness that impressed even veteran combat officers. The investigation revealed that the infiltrators had been members of an elite enemy unit with extensive special operations training and successful completion of similar missions at other installations. Their equipment was state-of-the-art, their planning was meticulous, and their execution had been flawless until they encountered Elena's unexpected resistance. Military intelligence analysts concluded that without Elena's intervention, the attack would have succeeded completely. The destruction of the supply depot would have crippled base operations for months and likely resulted in significant casualties among sleeping personnel. Her actions had not just prevented property damage, they had saved lives and preserved critical military capabilities. The media attention that followed was both a blessing and a curse for the military establishment. Elena's story captured public imagination as an example of individual heroism and determination, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about military policies regarding women in combat roles. Journalists began investigating other cases of qualified women being denied combat positions. Elena herself handled the attention with characteristic professionalism, giving brief interviews that focused on military training and preparedness, rather than gender politics or institutional criticism. She understood that excessive publicity could harm her career prospects, and preferred to let her actions speak for themselves rather than engaging in broader social commentary. Behind the scenes, however, significant changes were taking place within the military command structure. Elena's performance had provided undeniable evidence that combat effectiveness should be measured by individual capability rather than gender assumptions. Progressive officers seized the opportunity to push for policy reforms that had previously been blocked by conservative resistance. The most immediate change was Elena's rapid promotion and reassignment to active combat duty. Colonel Fedorov, perhaps hoping to minimize his own embarrassment, personally recommended her for advanced tactical training and a position with the base's elite response unit. His public statements praised her exceptional performance while carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of his previous misjudgment. Elena's new assignment placed her in exactly the role she had originally sought, a combat position where her skills could be fully utilized in defense of her country. Her new commanding officer, Major Sarah Chen, was one of the few senior women in the military and had followed Elena's story with great interest. "Volkov, your performance at the supply depot was impressive, but that was just the beginning," Major Chen explained during Elena's first briefing. "We've been monitoring enemy activity in the region, and what you faced was likely a preliminary operation. Intelligence suggests they're planning something much larger, and we need people with your tactical instincts to help prepare our defenses." The new position came with access to advanced weapons, tactical equipment, and training opportunities that Elena had been denied during her logistics assignment. More importantly, she was now working with other soldiers who respected her capabilities and welcomed her contributions to mission planning and execution. Elena's first major operation with her new unit involved tracking down the remaining members of the infiltration network that had attacked the supply depot. Intelligence had identified several safe houses and supply caches used by enemy forces, and Elena's experience with their tactics made her invaluable in planning counter-operations. Successful raids that followed demonstrated Elena's ability to work effectively as part of a team while continuing to excel in individual performance metrics. Her fellow soldiers quickly learned to rely on her tactical insights and marksmanship skills, and her reputation as a formidable combat asset spread throughout the military community. The policy changes that Elena's actions had catalyzed began affecting other women throughout the military system. New evaluation protocols focused on individual performance rather than gender-based assumptions, and several women who had been relegated to support roles found themselves reassigned to combat positions for which they were clearly qualified. Elena's story also had international implications. As military allies began examining their own policies regarding women in combat roles, her successful defense of the supply depot became a case study in military academies and strategic planning institutes, cited as evidence that tactical effectiveness transcends traditional gender boundaries. The transformation in Elena's career prospects was matched by changes in her personal confidence and sense of purpose. After months of frustration and suppressed potential, she was finally able to contribute her full capabilities to military operations. The rifle they had taken from her hands had been replaced by advanced weapon systems that she wielded with devastating effectiveness. However, Elena remained focused on the larger mission rather than personal vindication. The enemy forces that had attacked the supply depot were part of a broader threat to regional security, and her new position placed her at the forefront of efforts to neutralize that threat. Her success had opened doors, but walking through them would require continued excellence in increasingly dangerous situations. The psychological impact of her vindication was perhaps as important as the tactical advantages it provided. Elena had proven to herself and others that her capabilities were real and valuable, regardless of institutional biases that had temporarily limited their application. This confidence would prove crucial as she faced the greater challenges that lay ahead. As Elena prepared for her next mission, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a dismissed logistics clerk to a respected combat specialist. The path had been neither easy nor fair, but it had ultimately led to opportunities that might never have existed without the crucible of adversity and the dramatic proof of capability that her defense of the supply depot had provided. 6 months after the supply depot incident, Elena had become one of the most respected tactical specialists in the entire military district. Her success rate on missions was unprecedented, and her insights had contributed to several major victories against enemy forces that had previously seemed unstoppable. The woman who had once been deemed unfit for combat was now training other soldiers in advanced tactics and marksmanship. The final vindication of Elena's capabilities came during Operation Steel Dawn, a complex multi-phase assault designed to eliminate the command structure of the enemy network that had been conducting raids throughout the region. Elena was selected to lead a specialized team tasked with neutralizing the enemy's most dangerous operatives, including the masterminds behind the original supply depot attack. Intelligence had identified a fortified compound where enemy leadership was conducting a critical planning meeting. The target was heavily defended, with multiple layers of security and professional soldiers who had been specifically briefed about Elena's capabilities following her previous successes. This would be her most challenging mission yet, against opponents who knew exactly who they were facing. Elena's team consisted of 8 elite soldiers, each chosen for specific skills that complemented her tactical leadership. The mission required precise coordination, split-second timing, and flawless execution under extreme pressure. Any mistakes would likely result in the escape of high-value targets and the continuation of enemy operations throughout the region. The approach to the target compound took place under cover of a moonless night, with Elena's team moving through terrain that provided minimal concealment. Enemy sentries were equipped with night vision equipment and maintained overlapping fields of observation that made traditional infiltration approaches nearly impossible. Elena's solution was characteristically innovative. Rather than attempting to sneak past the security perimeter, she designed a tactical approach that used the enemy's own defensive preparations against them. By creating carefully timed distractions at multiple points around the compound, her team was able to exploit momentary gaps in surveillance coverage. The assault itself was a masterpiece of tactical coordination. Elena's team neutralized external security forces with surgical precision, while she led the primary assault on the main building where enemy leaders were meeting. The operation required her to engage multiple opponents simultaneously while protecting her team members and ensuring that high-value targets could not escape. Elena's performance during the final phase of the mission demonstrated the full extent of her tactical evolution. She had progressed from an individual marksman to a combat leader capable of coordinating complex operations while maintaining the personal effectiveness that had first brought her to military attention. Her ability to think strategically while executing flawlessly at the tactical level was unprecedented. The success of Operation Steel Dawn effectively ended the enemy network's capacity for organized resistance in the region. The elimination of key leadership figures and the capture of critical intelligence materials disrupted planned attacks and saved countless civilian and military lives. Elena's role in the operation earned her the highest military decorations available. More importantly for Elena personally, the mission represented the complete transformation of her military career, from frustrated potential to realized achievement. The officers who had once questioned her capabilities now sought her advice on tactical matters, and her opinions carried significant weight in strategic planning sessions. The institutional changes that Elena's career had catalyzed were now becoming permanent fixtures of military policy. Women throughout the armed forces were being evaluated based on individual merit rather than gender assumptions, and several had followed Elena's path from support roles to combat positions. Her success had opened doors that would benefit future generations of female soldiers. Elena's story also had broader implications for military effectiveness and personnel utilization. Her case demonstrated that institutional biases could prevent optimal use of available human resources, and military leaders began examining other areas where qualified personnel might have been underutilized due to incorrect assumptions. The training programs that Elena now led incorporated lessons learned from her own experiences with institutional resistance and ultimate vindication. She emphasized to her students that capability was more important than tradition, and that true military effectiveness required the best possible use of all available personnel, regardless of background or characteristics. Elena's relationship with Colonel Fedorov had evolved into one of mutual respect. Despite their difficult history, the colonel had publicly acknowledged his error in judgment regarding Elena's combat capabilities, and his support for expanded opportunities for women in combat roles had become genuine, rather than merely diplomatic. The supply depot, where Elena's transformation had begun, was now a training facility where her tactical innovations were taught to new generations of soldiers. The site had been converted into a monument to effective defense and individual excellence, with Elena's actions serving as the primary case study for students learning about tactical thinking and battlefield adaptation. As Elena looked back on her journey from dismissed logistics clerk to elite combat leader, she recognized that the obstacles she had faced had ultimately strengthened, rather than weakened her capabilities. The months of frustration and suppressed potential had created a determination and focus that might never have developed under easier circumstances. The rifle that had been stripped from her hands had been replaced by a career built on proven excellence and institutional respect. Elena's vindication was complete, but more importantly, her success had created opportunities for others who faced similar challenges. Her legacy would extend far beyond her individual achievements to encompass the systemic changes her performance had inspired. Elena Volkov had transformed from a woman fighting for recognition into a leader whose example would influence military policy and individual careers for decades.